Thank you so much, Denise, for that kind introduction. Thank you as well as, and Dr. Steve for inviting me to give a webinar for Autism Research Institute. Thanks for the wonderful things you're doing. I'm going to be talking about, as you can see from the title, brain plasticity, autism, and then how reading intervention can change the brain in autism. So to start with, I have conflict to declare or a conflict of interest. Some of the data I'm presenting today are partly funded by the Linda Mood Bell learning processes. In addition, the reading intervention used in our studies, which is visualizing and verbalizing, was provided by the Linda Mood Bell learning processes through their various centers across the country. However, no representatives of the company were involved in data analysis or development of this presentation, nor did the company exert any control or restrictions regarding research activities. So I've tried to divide this talk into 4 different segments. So we're going to talk about the descriptions of language and communication in autism, how the landscape of language and communication in the field of autism is. We'll go one step back and look at, the brain basis, the neurobiology of language and reading comprehension in autism. The third segment, we'll talk about brain plasticity or neuroplasticity, the unique ability of the brain to change itself. And then the last part of it, we'll talk about a study looking at reading intervention and how that changes the brain connections and brain activity in autistic children. So to start with, descriptions of language and communication in autism. What is the current landscape of language and communication in autism? So this is a busy slide. On top of it, in the top left, you can see a paper. It's titled Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact. So if you know, this is the first scientific paper published in the field of autism, and this was published in 1943 by Leo Kanner, who was a psychiatrist, at Johns Hopkins University. And immediately at the bottom, you can see 2 pictures there. So that's one of the cases described in Kanner's paper. So it's a set of case studies described in that 1943 paper. This is the first case or first participant. His name is Donald Triplett. And the picture on the left is, his childhood picture. He was 11 years old at that time. And on the right is the picture when he was much older. Donald Triplett died a few months ago in 2023. So at the bottom part, you can see a language sample from Triplett. Often he would utter random words or phrases. Words had a literal, inflexible meaning to Donald, and he was unable to recognize and apply the denotation of a word to another context. Each word had a definite, designated definition and association in his mind. For the most part, conversations with Donald consisted of a barrage of questions. So if you focus on that quote, you can see a couple of different interesting things there to note. One of those is, inflexibility in the use of language, like literal meaning or literal use of language. And a couple of other things is basically how you're using language in context to interpret meaning. And some of those things Donald had difficulty. So that's one sample of language from that first paper. Here is another one. During the last couple of years, I have become more aware of a kind of electricity that goes on between people. I have observed that when several people are together and having a good time, their speech and laughter follow a rhythm. I've always had a hard time fitting in with this rhythm, and I usually interrupt conversations without realizing my mistake. The problem is that I can't follow the rhythm. So this is coming from Temple Grandin and her book, The Thinking in Pictures. And you can see here very clearly, the problem here is application of language into social domain where the synchrony, so there is a clandestine or an unwritten sort of pact between the speaker and the listener in terms of synchrony of the conversation or communication. That rhythm of conversation is what is missing or what I can't capture. That's exactly what Temple Grandin is talking about. So 2 different things we just mentioned. One is the features or characteristics of language in autism, and then the second is how that is applied to communication and the difficulties there. Now, in the next few slides, I wanted to talk a little bit about what are these different aspects and characteristics of language. So this is one slide where you can see a snapshot of like 4 different dimensions of or descriptions of language in autism. Number 1, absence of verbal abilities. That's the failure to acquire spoken language during lifespan. You will see this in a lot of autistic individuals, like complete absence of a language. Number 2 is early language delays. So there is a delay in language, and with the first word produced at an average age of about 38 months instead of like typical 12 to 18 months window. The third one is atypical features of language production, including echolalia, jargon, all these different usages within language, jargony sentences or repeating the same thing, those kind of features, which are called atypical features. And then the last one is high-level discourse and pragmatic abilities. These are fluent speakers of the language, but at the same time have difficulty in interpreting figurative language. For example, irony, sarcasm, metaphor, all these kinds of language we play in our communication. So that's for the difficulties. So absence of verbal ability, delay in language, atypical features, and discourse processing difficulties, 4 different things. We'll see another one. Here you can see a lot of comorbid conditions with the language processing, So autism spectrum disorder with pragmatic language impairments, There's no other language difficulty here, but specifically in pragmatic language or the social use of language, that sort of difficulty. Number 2, a comorbidity with the developmental language delay and other developmental disorders. Number 3 is comorbidity with intellectual disability. And then the 4th one is severe difficulties in the development of social communication. So all we are going through here is different aspects of language and communication, and how the terrain of language and communication can be complicated and made difficult with comorbid conditions, as well as some of the inherent difficulties in some of the functions we were talking about. Couple of examples to point out here would be a function called joint attention. Many of you are familiar with joint attention. If you interacted with the children, you can clearly see that in the first picture, you can see the child is pointing to something. And while pointing, the child is trying to take the attention of the people around to that object or thing which they are seeing. That means, they are inviting a triadic sort of interaction, a joint attention there. The second one is, somebody else in the vicinity of the child is pointing to something, and then the child is looking at that and then looking back to the person who is pointing. So the first one is called initiating joint attention, and the second one is responding to joint attention. So these are important behaviors in the social landscape of a child developing, but at the same time, at the bottom, you can see studies showing that the joint engagement or joint attention behavior is predicting word comprehension at different stages. So it has a very clear impact of like how children are understanding that the other person around can be shared, the language can be shared with, or ideas can be shared with that person. So word comprehension plays a significant role here, and joint attention is playing a significant role in word comprehension at that early stage. That's another element or function which is affecting language development. You can see homograph tasks. So here, the issue we talked about earlier is, one of the things, Donald had difficulty with is basically integrating a situation or a sentence or a word with the context. So here you can see sentences in this experiment. The girls were climbing over the hedge. Mary's dress remained spotless, but Lucy's dress was, in Lucy's dress, there was a big tear. Right? So there was a big tear in her dress. There was a big tear in her eye. So the same word spelled the same way, but they are pronounced different ways, depending on the context in which, that word appears actually. And what the finding from this study from Francesca Happe in 1997 was that even if you present that context to the participants, autistic individuals are difficult. It did not make any difference in terms of them interpreting those sentences, whereas the control participants had significant difference, in significant help, when they learned the context, to interpret those sentences. So another difficulty, which is one of the characteristics which we listed earlier in terms of integrating context with the word meaning or sentence to understand the meaning. So just to sum up, some of the points we discussed here, difficulty, like what components of reading comprehension fail typically in autism, and difficulty in reading comprehension may be associated with the cognitive profile of the reader mostly, and these difficulties can emerge from difficulty in perspective taking, which is basically understanding other people's thought process, like how they are thinking from their perspective, difficulty in inference construction. We just talked about like integrating two different information to construct inferences, difficulty in mentalizing, which is reading other people's minds, mind reading, very much related to the perspective taking point that we were talking about. Difficulty in linguistic information processing, of course, language processing difficulty. And then the last one, difficulty in pragmatic aspect of language, which is the social use of language. And if you apply this to reading, so on this slide, what you're looking at is a study by Brown et al. 2013, where they were looking at reading comprehension as well as decoding ability, right? And reading ability versus reading comprehension in a large number of studies, about 40 to 50 studies. And you can see in the picture there at the bottom, if you look at the first segment there, decoding strength and decoding weakness. So across these studies in autism, you can see that, most of those studies showed that, autistic children have decoding strength. So they are reasonably good in reading ability or decoding ability. But if you switch to the right side, you can see the same thing, but the bottom part is different there. Comprehension weaknesses and then reading comprehension strengths. And you can see that graph mostly shifting towards the left, which is across those studies, most of those studies showing reading comprehension as a weakness in autistic children. So one is a strength, decoding as a strength, and then comprehension as a weakness. So this profile is something which we are going to talk about a little bit in this talk, and that's called the discrepant comprehender, discrepant poor comprehender profile of reading. Just to sum up, this first section, we were talking about, again, a quote from Leo Kanner: reading skill is acquired quickly, but the children read monotonously, and a story or moving picture is experienced in unrelated portions rather than its coherent totality. So the key piece here is, what autistic children may be missing is, processing things together in a more coherent sort of fashion, and they may be relying more on piecemeal sort of processing, or they are weakly centrally coherent in some ways, you can say. So that central coherence may be missing or limited, and the processing may be piecemeal without getting a holistic view of the sentences or language in general. The second section, we're going to take a step back and look at, brain, language, and reading comprehension in autism spectrum disorder. So by now, I think, we just went through some of the characteristics and difficulties in autism. Now we'll look at some of the brain imaging evidence, studies, and what they are pointing out in terms of understanding the brain basis of language and reading in autistic individuals. So in this slide, what you're seeing is a study from Elizabeth Redkay in 2008. This was published in 2008. The study was done with toddlers. So toddlers were brought to the MRI scanner, and they were sleeping in the scanner. While the toddlers were sleeping in the scanner, they played words, auditorily, so that the children can hear that. Although, so despite they are sleeping in the scanner, their brain is actively picking up, these signals. And on the left-hand side, you can see the brain activity pattern. All you need to look at is that central bar there, and that bar shows the more yellowish red it gets, it shows more LH, which is left hemisphere of the brain activity, more than the right hemisphere. The more bluer it gets towards the bottom of it, it shows right hemisphere RH activity more than LH. And now if you look at the brain and the colors on both sides, the left-hand side is the control participant, and on the right is the autistic participants, you can see more bluer color on the autistic brains there, which means that the autistic children listening to these words while they are sleeping is showing more activity in their left hemisphere, in their right hemisphere for the language processing. So clearly showing a bias towards which hemisphere is participating more in language processing. You can see that lateralization more shifted towards the right hemisphere in autistic toddlers. And this is one of our studies at the bottom. You're seeing very similar to the homograph we were talking about, but this study is done with adult autistic individuals. You can see sentences there. Sam ran from the bank when the angry robber hurried out with the money. Sam ran from the bank when the huge alligator jumped out with a fish. So these are two things are ambiguous sentences, basically. And the word bank is exactly the same in both sentences, but their meaning is completely different depending on the context. In the first one, when the angry robber hurried out with the money, which means a bank as a financial institution. And in the second one, angry alligator jumped out with a fish, which means the bank is the river bank there. So the understanding of these two ambiguous sentences can be slightly different, and you can see different pattern of activity in autism and control participants. You see very similar pattern on the left hemisphere, but in control participants, if you look at the bottom of it, you see hardly any activity in the right hemisphere in controls, but you can see more right hemisphere recruitment in autistic participants to solve these kind of sentences and understand what they are. Here is another one, a couple of other studies which we did with adult participants where they are processing these figurative language like puns. As you can see the title of the paper, The Archaeologist's Career Ended in Ruins. So you either understand the joke in that sentence or you don't understand, right? And so if you understand the joke, which means you are interpreting multiple things there and taking that context, and putting that in context and understanding the joke or the multiple meanings involved there. And you see the pattern of activities there. So the black bars are the control participants, the gray bars are the autism participants there. And if you look at the left part of that graph, you can see every single black bar is higher, more activity, which is in control participants than in autism on the left side. But if you look at towards the right part of that graph, you can see all those places, gray bars are higher, which means they are all right hemisphere areas of the brain showing more activity in the right hemisphere in autistic participants there. And on the right hand side, this is from another study showing activity differences in a couple of different areas, where the Broca's and Wernicke's area of the brain considered classic language areas showing different pattern of activity in autism and control participants. Here is a meta-analysis of language studies, language and brain studies in autism. Meta-analysis, most of you probably know, this is an analysis of analysis. Basically, you're looking at several different studies, published in the field of autism, and then you kind of take a weighted average across all those different studies and see where the center of mass of brain activity across all those studies is falling. So if you look at the picture on the top, so you can see these are all language and brain studies. The reddish color is the typical or the control participants. The green is the autistic participants, and then the slight yellow color there is the overlap. You can see the Broca's area and Wernicke's area activation there, and the pattern of activity is very much overlapping in both cases. But at the bottom figure, when you statistically compare these two different groups, you can see some differences there, and those differences are, you can see more activity or less activity in autism, which are these reddish orange areas you can see at the bottom in the left hemisphere language areas compared to the control participants there. Similarly, so this is another one where one of our studies, which we did in 2006, we gave adult autistic participants several different sentences to process in the MRI scanner. And some of the sentences look like, number 8 when rotated 90 degrees looks like a pair of eyeglasses. Which means that when you're reading that sentences, you have to imagine number 8, and then you have to perform that 90-degree rotation. Yeah, now it looks like, a pair of eyeglasses. And then you're saying whether that's correct or incorrect, basically. And then you compare that with garden variety sentences like, addition, subtraction, and multiplication are all math skills. So the key difference between these two types of sentences is, the top ones are high imagery sentences. So you have to visually imagine those sentences more, whereas the bottom sentences are low imagery sentences, and we wanted to look at the differences between these two in terms of brain activity. But interestingly, one of the things which we found was that, the low imagery sentences, which do not demand visual imagery generation that much as high imagery sentences, showed or elicited a lot of visuospatial activation in our autistic participants. So you can see here some of the parietal areas of the brain, superior parietal areas of the brain, left and right, which is primarily involved in visuospatial processing, showing significantly more activity in autistic participants compared to control participants there. So we have been seeing a pattern in the last few slides, and I'll try to sum up in a second. Hope you follow that. We saw a bunch of regions showing right hemisphere more activity in autistic participants. We saw a couple of studies showing less left hemisphere activity in autistic participants. Now you're seeing more activity in the visuospatial areas in autistic participants. Here is a very recent meta-analysis which we did and published a month ago, looking at the neurobiological map of theory of mind and pragmatic communication in autistic participants. So again, more discourse-related processing studies, across many studies of pragmatic communication and across many studies of understanding what other people are thinking. We looked at the brain activity patterns there. And again, there is significant overlap if you look at the first column there in both theory of mind as well as pragmatics there. But if you look at the right side in column, where you're seeing the statistical differences between the two groups, you see key areas of the social cognitive network. Here you can see a region called medial prefrontal cortex, here another area of the brain called temporoparietal junction. These are areas involved in theory of mind or thinking about other people's thought processes, those regions showing reduced brain activity in autistic participants. So just to sum up, the emerging themes from language processing in autism, you can see a pattern, like, for example, more Wernicke's area activation and less Broca's area activation in autism. Probably, more word level processing and less integrated sort of sentence level processing can be seen. And then we saw a few studies showing more right hemisphere activation, suggesting probably more difficulty or compensatory sort of activity in processing sentences or complex language. And then we just saw more parietal and occipital area of activation showing more visual oriented or visual sort of thinking, just like the temporal grandins, thinking in pictures, more visual thinking you can see there. So more Wernicke's activation, more right hemisphere activation, and more visuospatial processing related activation you can see as emerging pattern in brain and language in autism. So the third segment wanted to talk about is how we can use some of these knowledge which we are learning from neuroimaging studies, as well as behavioral and neuropsychological studies about language and communication and autism, and then target that with intervention, right? And so before that, we need to understand plasticity or brain plasticity in autism. So let's look at that section. So before we start, we're going to focus on reading brains. So this is an interesting section from the book by Marianne Wolf. The book is titled Proust and the Squid. We were never born to read. Human beings invented reading only a few thousand years ago. And with this invention, we rearranged the very organization of our brain. Reading is one of the single most remarkable inventions in history. So the interesting aspect of this, on an evolutionary scheme of things, human beings were never supposed to read, right? Or never ready to read. So hunter-gatherers, you are more visual individuals, right? Visual beings. And suddenly, on an evolutionary landscape, reading came about, and that needs to be addressed in the brain. And the reason I'm putting this here is, this itself shows brain plasticity. That means that, the real estate which was devoted for some other purposes in the brain has to be rearranged or recycle to take care of this sudden need, which is to take care of reading. So in some ways, plasticity, uh, if plasticity is not there, brain plasticity is not there, then we wouldn't have been able to take care of reading as a function. So in that way, I think plasticity is inherent to reading, to the brain. And in this picture, what you're seeing is a classic study or a set of studies done, some in the 80s and then some in the following couple of decades. So the key point to think about here is that until the 1980s, many neuroscientists even thought that once the child is born and the child goes through probably the critical period of development, there is no change to that child's brain. This was the belief at that time, actually. And then there were this very interesting studies, and those studies were looking at the song nucleus in the songbirds of their brain. So these are songbirds which will these birds will produce songs in different seasons, right? Spring season, fall season, summer season, etc., etc. And the researchers were measuring a part of their brain, these birds' brain, called song nucleus. And song nucleus help these brain to produce songs, just like the Broca's area helps human beings to produce speech. We can speak because of our Broca's area. So when they measured the volume of this song nucleus in different seasons, like spring season versus summer season, what they found is that the size of the song nucleus, the volume of it was significantly more in spring season compared to summer season. And why was that? Because the number of songs these birds were singing in spring season is significantly more than that they were singing in summer season, which means that the more you're utilizing a certain part of the brain, which in this case is the song nucleus, the size of that or the volume of that structure is changing or increasing, which is a significant finding. And then follow-up studies, you can see with modern technologies, you can see some of the fibers, which are going through the brains of these birds, changing its size. And if you look at the spring season size of this set of fibers here on the left-hand side compared to the summer season here, the size of these fibers in the spring season is significantly more than the summer season. So in other words, this is kind of like the idea of the neural Darwinism in some ways, the use it or lose it things. The more you're using it, the chances of a part of that brain to increase its size and function is significantly more. And that addresses the idea of brain plasticity. And I wanted to read this quote from Antonio Damasio, a well-known neuroscientist. The discovery that new neurons can appear in the adult brain may be the most surprising of the last quarter century of neuroscience. The scale of the phenomenon and its significance remains to be established, but it appears that one of the oldest dogmas in business is not true. So this was a question, like what was the single most influential finding in the field of neuroscience? And the question was posed to several different neuroscientists, and this was Damasio's answer to that, which means that, many years ago, until maybe a couple of decades ago, neuroscientists thought that no new neurons can be formed, and then now we have a lot of evidence pointing to even in adult individuals, neurogenesis takes place. So that's a huge aspect of brain plasticity. And in this set of examples, you can see here studies done with neuroimaging. On the top is a well-known study done in taxi drivers in London, and they looked at the brain volume of a certain structure called hippocampus, right, which is involved in memory, especially spatial memory. And they looked at experienced drivers, taxi drivers in London City, people who have been driving for probably 20 years or so, versus novice drivers in that city. And what they found is very interesting. As the experience of these drivers in that city is increasing, part of the hippocampus of their brain, the posterior part of the hippocampus, which is specifically involved in spatial memory, significantly increased its size compared to the novice drivers. So here again clearly shows that a person or a driver who have been driving in that city for 20 years or so has the city mapped out in their memory very clearly, which means that hippocampus has been in use in those individuals compared to nervous drivers, And you can also see similar studies with Buddhist monks, right? Monks going through meditation. So a Buddhist monk who probably has 20,000 hours of meditation experience has a different pattern of connectivity in their brain or orientation of some of these structures compared to this meditators. So all this is to indicate the importance of brain plasticity, as well as the process and production of new neurons and plasticity, and the chance for change of these brains, even as an adult. Now, coming to reading, the importance of like brain plasticity and connecting it with reading. So this is one of the earlier studies of reading and brain imaging in 2003 with dyslexia children. And you can see here, the study was done in comparison with control participants. So typical reading children, while rhyming tasks, so they were given a task of rhyming, and then you can see the pattern of activity compared there in typical children or normal children here, and a couple of regions of activations are marked there, and dyslexic reading children while rhyming, and you can see the absence of those activity in dyslexic children. So basically, when they tested at time point 1, you can see the brains of typical children responding in certain areas, and those regions were not showing activity in dyslexic children during that time. And then they went for an intervention for some time, fast forward intervention. And after that intervention program, dyslexic children showed increase in brain activity or presence of brain activity in some of those regions which were absent during that earlier time. Clearly showing that the instruction probably has helped in terms of processing how these tasks can be done, and then showing brain activity as a result of that. Here is another study involving children, and what you're looking at there is different time points. And so T1 is time point 1, and T2 is time point 2, and T3 is time point 3, which is a follow-up after time point 2. And what the researchers here were looking at the gray matter volume and its changes in a following intervention, again in dyslexic children, right? So dyslexic children were sent to intervention for some time. So at time point 1, some of these brain regions, like in a fusiform area, hippocampus, etc., you can see the percentage signal or gray matter volume is minimal there in these children at time point 1. And then they take intervention and come back, and at the second scan at T2, you can see significant increase in volume of the gray matter at that time point. And then they waited for some time and then looked at a time point 3, and some of those changes sustained for a third time point. So clearly showing the plasticity of the brain in changing the gray matter volume there, and that volume change sustaining after the intervention is over and after a certain time period there. So just wanted to connect this with the reading comprehension and intervention, which we are going to talk about in our own studies. And so this is an interesting book and theoretical view by Ellen Pavio. So I accept the obvious truism that language played a critical role in our giant leap as a species, but language never worked its magic alone, and it cannot do so now. Instead, it has always depended on a silent partner that provides it with something to talk about, a general cognitive system that had evolved to a high level before it invited language in as a co-player in the evolutionary scene. So the second part is more interesting. I see language as a benevolent octopus-like parasite whose tentacles invaded the brain and was empowered by it to survive and thrive to the point where it could contribute something useful to its host. So this beautiful quote, trying to explain what we were trying to do earlier in terms of the origin of reading here, right? So what Pavio talks about is he proposed a theory called dual coding theory. So proposes that language and thought are interconnected. And what he says here is, I see language as a benevolent octopus-like parasite whose tentacles invaded the brain and was empowered by it to survive and thrive to the point where it could contribute something useful to its host. So language it didn't have a space in the brain to start with. So just like we were talking about reading, you can easily substitute language here, language had to invade the brain like an octopus-like parasite and spread its tentacles to capture the space to take care of that function in terms of language processing. Again, a classic support for the idea of brain plasticity, and we will try to use this idea and the principle of dual coding theory to intervene and understand language and reading difficulty in autism and how it can be changed or addressed. So that brings me to the last segment of our talk, which talks about a specific intervention, visualizing and verbalizing for reading comprehension and thinking. That's what, or language comprehension and thinking. That's what the intervention is called. Simply put, a VV intervention. And in autism spectrum disorders, what the intervention does and its changes in the brain. So this is an NIH-funded clinical trial, which we are doing right now. So it is ongoing at this stage. You can see there are several different components to this study. At phase 1, we have a set of neuropsychological assessments. So we are looking at children between the age of 7 and 13, autistic children, as well as typical controlled children, as well as typical controlled children with a reading difficulty. So we have 3 or 4 different groups participating in the study. They go through a set of neuropsychological procedures at time point 1, and then we do an MRI scan on these children, looking at their structure of the brain, a function of the brain when they are engaged in different language tasks such as word processing or word similarity task, sentence comprehension task, resting state fMRI, and so on and so forth. Then they go for an intervention, which is the visualizing and verbalizing for language comprehension and thinking. I was just talking about the intervention consists of like 4 hours per day, 5 days a week, 10 weeks long, adding up to a total of 200 hours of instruction. So that's a pretty intense intervention, 4 hours per day, 5 days a week, 10 weeks long, adding up to 200 hours of instruction on building visual imagery to comprehend language. That's the basis of this, and we'll get to that in a second. And after the intervention, after 10 weeks, they come back for the second phase of the study, where we go through another set of neuropsychological assessment and then another round of MRI scanning. Okay, so as I said, again, 3 or 4 different groups of participants. So we have autism experimental group, who will come for the testing and scanning. They will take the intervention for 10 weeks, come back for the second test and scanning. We have also another set of autistic group called autistic waitlist control group. They will come for the testing and scanning at time point 1. They will wait it out. They won't take the intervention for 10 weeks. So they will wait out until 10 weeks, come back for the second set of testing and scanning, and then they will take the intervention. And we have control group doing the same as well. So this is the assessment protocol, so we have a set of items there. I'm not going to go through all of it, but a couple of things to think about here. The eligibility for the studies, we are looking at children who can read comfortably well, but they are not understanding what they are reading, or their reading comprehension is poorer than their decoding ability. So remember the slide I was showing you earlier about the discrepant poor comprehender profile, where you can see good decoding abilities accompanied by below average, comprehension abilities. So that's the group which we are targeting, and we are using Slauson oral reading test. For decoding, they need to have a score of more than 37th percentile there, and the comprehension is measured by using Gray oral reading test, or GORT, where they need to have below 37th percentile score there, and they also need to have an IQ of above 75. That helps with their task performance as well as getting into the scanner and so on and so forth. And then we do a lot of other testing there. We measure receptive language, expressive language, oral language comprehension, phonological processing, problem-solving skills, verbal and visual memory, symptom severity, of course, diagnosis of autism, executive functions, and a set of things, takes about 3 hours or so in terms of the testing. And as I said, for the scanning, we do a structural scan, which we can use to look at the brain structure, volume, thickness, etc., etc. We look at different functional scans. We have a word similarity task. We have a verbal absurdity task, and then we have a resting state scan where they are not doing anything but looking at the screen, and then we look at their brain activity. And then we also have a scan called diffusion imaging to look at the fibers of the brain and how they are connecting different parts of the brain to look at the integrity of those fibers. The reading intervention, as I said, is executed by the Lindamood-Bell learning processes. It's called the Visualizing and Verbalizing for Language Comprehension and Thinking, or VV intervention program. So the basic idea of VV intervention is to use visual imagery to reach language difficulty. So using a strength which we see in many autistic individuals and autistic children, and use that strength to reach and intervene and help with a potential deficit or impairment or difficulty, which is the language comprehension or reading comprehension. Now you can probably connect the two different dots which I've been talking about earlier. Like one of the things we looked at in terms of brain imaging studies was an increased use of visual areas of the brain to comprehend language in autistic individuals, and also you can see from anecdotal records as well, as other behavioral studies, many studies report autistic individuals showing increased visual spatial abilities. And then you have the literature showing language difficulty as well as the language altered patterns of brain activation for language comprehension. So use one of these strengths in visual imagery or visual spatial processing to intervene and help with the difficulty in comprehension. So the intervention goes through several different process here, steps, in the program, like picture-to-picture imagining, word imaging or imagining, sentence imaging, sentence-by-sentence imaging, sentence-by-sentence with interpretation, multiple sentence imaging, paragraph imaging, and paragraph-by-paragraph imaging base. So if you look at 1 to 6 there, you can start from the basic simple unit and then build up on that one to get to the paragraph and interpret things which are more complex there. So that's the mechanism or the internal process in the visualizing and verbalizing intervention. So I wanted to present some data. As I mentioned, some of these are preliminary data to a certain extent. We have some preliminary data which we collected before, and some of the data is which we are collecting as the study is still ongoing. And what you're looking at here is the score on the y-axis for GORT in the first graph, and then the second one is the SORT. And to remind you again, GORT is the one for language or reading comprehension, and SORT is for the reading ability or the decoding ability. And on the x-axis, you can see the experimental group and the weightless control group. The gray bar indicate phase 2 or the post-test, and then the black bar indicate the pre-test. And you see, if you look at the second graph there to start with, you can see there is not much difference in the experimental group from time 1 to time 2, or the weightless control group from time 1 to time 2 in terms of the decoding scores. So they are pretty much in a similar ballpark there. But if you look at the comprehension scores, there's not a significant difference between time 1 and time 2 in the group which did not receive intervention, right? But if you look at the autistic children's group which received the intervention, you can see a significant improvement in the comprehension scores from time point 1 to time point 2 in the experimental group as a result of intervention. So clearly showing, so this is the same thing, but a blown up sort of graph here to show the same effect there. Y-axis is the comprehension score. You can see a significant change in the comprehension score, improvement in the comprehension score in the children who received the VV intervention from time 1 to time 2. We also wanted to look at, so a couple of slides at the introduction I presented, I showed like some of the factors which may be affecting language comprehension or reading comprehension in autism. And we talked about several different processes there, right? Social skills could be a factor, mentalizing could be a factor, memory could be a factor, and so on and so forth. So here, a couple of interesting trends which we are seeing again, and this might change as we are adding more participants. Here you can see the social responsiveness scale, that is SRS, which measures social ability or social thinking and social responsiveness. And the higher the social responsiveness scale score, that means the more difficulty you have in social interaction. And you can see here that children with lower social cognition or social responsiveness scale score, which means they are better at social cognition, they are showing more significant improvement in language comprehension as a result of intervention. So here, what we are looking at is another element, which is probably the social ability, showing some sort of relationship with or a mediating factor in terms of improving comprehension. And as I said before, we have language comprehension, and so there are several factors influencing that difficulty. And here may be one indication of that, just like joint attention showing word comprehension ability. Here you can see social ability predicting language comprehension. Here is another one, Peabody picture vocabulary test, and so that is PPVT, and you can see low PPVT score showing improvement. People with the lower score, they're showing less ability, them benefiting more from the intervention compared to the ones who had higher score to start with. So these the ones who have lower scores at the beginning is benefiting more from the intervention and showing significant improvement as a result of intervention at time point 2. This is a complex graph, but the quick take-home message here is, here again, we tested several different functions, and one of the key things which was coming out from this is basically verbal memory, right? Verbal working memory, for example, becoming a significant factor in terms of processing language and improvement in comprehension. And some of these are fitting with the findings in literature showing several different factors like word learning ability, word comprehension, and working memory. Many of these factors influencing comprehension, and we can clearly see that probably the intervention is tapping into or mediating some of those functions to improve comprehension here. Now, if you switch to the brain level changes here, as you can see at the top picture, if you look at that, so that picture is a snapshot of the reading network of the brain. Right, so when children are reading sentences, this is the pattern of brain activity you can see there. So if you point some of those regions there, you can see the left hemisphere solid pattern of activity in the left inferior frontal gyrus area, which is called the Broca's area loosely. And then you can see some of the activity in the superior temporal area, which is the Wernicke's area. Here again, you can see some of the right hemisphere cohorts of activity there as well. So that's the general network of brain activity. So this includes autism, control, everybody together. We wanted to create a map of that brain activity in different areas. Now, at the bottom part, if you look at, specifically looking at, the experimental group of our children, and before intervention, what is the pattern of activity? And then after the intervention, what's the pattern of activity? You can see clearly that some of the patterns of activity is missing at the before intervention stage. Here we see some activity in Broca's area, but not much in the temporal or the Wernicke's area at all. But after 10 weeks of intervention, you can see a significant change in activity in these children, and that is spreading into many other areas you can see. So significant change in activity as a result of intervention there. So this is another busy slide, but I wanted to point out to a concept called connectivity. Connectivity talks about, the teamwork of the brain, how the brain regions in different parts of the brain are talking to each other or interacting with each other as a team to accomplish a certain function, basically. So here, from an MRI perspective, what we are looking at is, if region A is active and region B is active in the brain during a certain task, what we are trying to look at is, are regions A and B active at the same time? If they are active at the same time, the signal from each of those regions may be correlated. It will show higher correlation. Then we would say that, those two regions are highly connected or they are talking to each other. Simply put it, we would say they show higher connectivity or stronger connectivity compared to two regions which are activated at different times, so they are activating at a haphazard sort of pattern. Right. So we looked at the brain connectivity between some of these structures, so you can see the IFG marked here, which is the Broca's area, and then the middle to posterior temporal area, which is loosely the Wernicke's area. And what we are seeing is that, from time point 1 to time point 2, the connectivity between these two classic language areas is significantly increased in participants who received intervention from time point 1 to time point 2. There is a change in them. And interestingly, one more interesting part here to look at here is that, this change in connectivity is also correlated with the comprehension score measured by the Gray oral reading test. So a couple of things to summarize, as take-home message from here is that we are seeing a change in comprehension from time point 1 to time point 2, change in brain activity in some of the classic language areas from time point 1 to time point 2, and then change in brain connectivity from time point 1 to time point 2 as a result of intervention. And then finally, some of these changes, like for example, the increase in connectivity from time point 1 to time point 2 is related to increase in comprehension. So that means that behavioral function, which is comprehension change or improvement, is connected with a brain level measure, which is change in functional connectivity from time point 1 to time point 2. Here is more of the same, but a different measure of Broca's area and Wernicke's area connectivity. So what we are seeing is that, if you take, Broca's area as one region, we call it like seed of the brain, and then look at the connectivity patterns of this region with several different areas of the brain. Similarly, we take Wernicke's area as a seed, and then look at the connectivity of this region with the rest of the brain. And then when you see that after intervention, you see such significant increase in connectivity in many of these regions. So any yellowish red regions which you're seeing in the brains here is showing a post-test increase in activity compared to the pre-test, more connectivity and activity patterns at the post level compared to a post-test level compared to the pre-test. That's exactly what we're seeing there. Again, another measure of connectivity here. Again, you can see local connectivity, which means if you take a seed or a region there and then look at the immediate neighbors of it and how that region is connected to different parts of it. Here again, you can see some of the regions showing increased connectivity from pre to post as a result of intervention, and how that is correlated with the change in comprehension score, which we were talking about before. So just to summarize, some of the things which we were talking about, so we started with the language landscape and communication landscape and difficulties in autistic individuals. We looked at the brain basis of or mechanisms underlying some of those, and then plasticity as a mechanism to target, and change some of these difficulties in autism, and then finally our study showing some of the changes in brain and behavioral patterns and in performance as a result of intervention. So reading comprehension improved in autistic children as a result of 10-week VV intervention. Improvement in comprehension was predicted by many other factors like verbal memory, social responsiveness, and so on and so forth. And then improvement in reading comprehension was found to be associated with functional connectivity change, between Broca's and Wernicke's areas from pre-test to post-test. And you can see these are some of the papers which we have published from our preliminary data. So all of these papers, talk about different aspects of behavioral and brain function changes as a result of VV intervention in autistic children. And we need your help. As I said, we are recruiting more and more participants. I think the pandemic has, delayed our recruitment a little bit, but we are seeking participants. And you can see the flyer there, there's number there, and my email is there on the right side as well. Please reach out for participating in our study. Again, we are looking at 7 to 13-year-old children, autistic or non-autistic children. We are looking all types of children there. And if they qualify, they get a free intervention, which is the visualizing, verbalizing for language comprehension and thinking. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and I wanted to thank our funding sources as well as the lot of different people in the lab and collaborators who make these things happen in terms of projects and data collection, so on and so forth. And so thanks to NIDCD for the funding R01 to facilitate this huge project. And then thanks to Linda Moodwell for funding the preliminary pilot work for this project as well. So I will stop there and happy to take any questions at this stage. Thank you.
All right. As you can imagine, there are a lot of questions, so we only have 7 minutes, but we will get through as many as we can. Lots of thank yous for the great information. One repeated question was, what can parents do right now? Like if you're at home and you want to start working on visual, verbal with your families, is there a book that they could buy? Or, I mean, I know obviously you mentioned that there are intervention companies like Linda Moodwell. Is there anything a parent who's interested in this could order on Amazon right now?
That's a good question. I think, I mean, Linda Moodbell is the first thing which comes to mind, and all their interventions are, to a large extent, relying on visual imagery and visual thinking. But it can, I mean, it comes with a cost, right? The other thing which can probably help is the PECS, picture exchange communicative system, which is I think, a well-known intervention system in teaching kids, but that's mainly targeted at non-verbal, autistic kids. These are the things I can quickly think about, but there may be probably other ones which I'm not aware of. Yeah.
Okay. So when you look at this from the perspective of connectivity and disconnectivity of brain organization, what do neurodevelopmental disorders like ASD, dyslexia, etc., and their various combinations look like to you? It would be valuable to hear your comment, even if it's short.
Yeah, what an excellent question, and also a very difficult question to answer too, as well. Like in many cases in autism, one of the things you find is, this is from my own experience too, that if you give autistic children implicit tasks, which means you're not giving them clear direction, but you have to infer somehow things, right? They may have difficulty in doing that. But if you tell them explicitly, the instructions can be made clear, you can see a performance difference in many times. And why I'm saying this is that many times it's a matter of showing that exact technique, right? Of using that. I think a quick thing which comes to mind is there are a lot of face processing studies in autism showing altered patterns of activity in different areas, like, for example, fusiform face area showing different pattern of activity. But there are also studies showing explicitly telling participants to look at certain part of the face, like, for example, at the center of the forehead or next to the eye, and them showing fusiform activity in those ones. So by intervention in general, you probably are kind of like waking up some of those connections which probably otherwise are not active, and but by teaching them and telling them. This is just like classic learning, for example, like all your brains and my brain may be different at 12 o'clock today versus 2 o'clock today, right? Because within that 2 hour window we might have learned a lot of things, so that shows the plasticity, right? We are constantly learning things, so a dormant connection, a connection which was not there otherwise, probably need to be tickled, or maybe just like initiated to have that connection formed, and that's exactly what we are probably looking at in neurodevelopmental disorders in general, like autism or ADHD, that if there is a dormant sort of connection, how to wake up that connection and activate or strengthen that. And that's exactly these interventions are probably trying to do.
Okay, great. This question's asking about testing of nonverbal kids. So when you're doing these visual verbal tests or interventions, are you able to test nonverbal kids? And if so, what did you have a tool that you used for that?
Yeah, a good question. So I don't think I will be able to answer that, because we are pre-selecting our children for our study as verbal children, right? Because they have to process a certain level of language and tasks they have to do. So we are selecting that type of children mostly in our tasks, so and I think the ones which we have some tests, their picture vocabulary tests and so on and so forth, where we can gain some information from that, but I think our group is kind of pre-selected for certain things, and also we have another measure as eligibility. Their IQ is also another factor there, and some of these abilities for them to perform these tasks.
Okay, so is there reason to believe that this could work at any point in your lifespan, not just in children or teenagers? Would we believe this might work throughout life, doing this type of intervention?
I would say yes. And the reason for that is, and I think, from an intervention perspective, I think Linda Moodbell intervention, they have been doing this intervention with not only with children, but, for example, traumatic brain injury patients, right? TBI patients, who lose language, and these are adults usually. And there were studies, showing change in language function, or bringing back some of those comprehension and speech ability as a result of this intervention. in a different way to look at is that, plasticity, right? New neurons are formed at all stages, even in adult as well as in old age, right? There are interventions, other types of intervention with stroke victims, and stroke victims are usually in the ages beyond 50 or 60 and so on and so forth. Even in them, new neurons are formed as a result of brain plasticity. So intervention can target. And so I don't think any time is probably late, in starting an intervention, whatever that is, in changing function and brain.
All right, great. Well, we are out of time. I really appreciate your time today. This was a great presentation. There's still more questions, so I'm hoping at some point we can have you back and maybe we could address some of those questions at a future date.
Happy to do that. Yeah, thank you so much.